downstairs trying to patch it. Last thing I did was patch into the room, right? And there were people lining up down the hallway that would come in. And I'm like, you know, I said, you got to wait till somebody on the staff comes in. So the staff were going in. She looks at me, she goes, what are you doing? I go, I have permission to plug in. She said, well, we have a meeting. I said, yeah, I'm just plugging in. We're doing hearing up 2212. Or down to 2212. She goes, up to 2212. I was like, right. I mean, thanks, asshole. Right. You know.
That happens to be up. But I think
All right. How we doing here? Good?
yeah, I think we're pretty good.
We got control and all that?
Yeah, I think he does. I haven't actually checked.
Good afternoon, sir. How are you?
What's up, man? How you doing?
Doing all right. Doing all right. Anything that you see that we have set up that we move for you? You guys are clear, right? Yeah. And you don't mind the lights either, do you? Yeah, no, lights are good. Yeah. Okay, good. I'm Pop. We've met many times.
I just remember a lot.
Yes, sir.
JJ, your audio GUI only can hold 5 mics. That's
All right,
probably why
Mr.
you can't get audio out 6. Only hold 5. Where'd you get that
You
up?
got the signal up?
Where'd you
Yes.
get 6 boxes from?
All right.
JJ? Yeah, okay. Dude, your GUI only holds 5 mics. Now you know you gotta you know this room's supposed to have a breakout box where you can plug in and hook 8 mics up to it.
Oh yeah, you want to listen? Quick check. It's on 1 and 2.
Alright, you should do that. I mean, and then you can put it.
Check, check, check. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. Check 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Okay.
Check 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
I'll disconnect the one that doesn't.
Do you need this key tip in here?
I don't know what that's about.
I just hit timer reset. I gotta go start the timer and check it.
I wouldn't think so. Hello, check 1, 2, 3. Paul, you hearing this? Check 1, 2. Check 1, 2, 3. Mike, check 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Check 1, 2. Hello, mic check 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Check 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Check 1, 2. Check 1, 2. I'm not sure. Are you hearing it? Hello. Well, they're coming out of the backs of the CCUs. It sounds good. Does it sound good? Well, shoot then. We're ready to check in.
What do you need to hear? One, two, three, four, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
Check, check, check. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Microphone check 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 for C-SPAN transmission, I hope. Microphone check 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Check, check, check. Good. Continuing mic check 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 from the witness table. Microphone check 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Check, check, check 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. This is a microphone check 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Keep going. Microphone check. Continuing microphone check 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Let me see if I can find something to read. Microphone check 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Check, check, check. That's a good story to read right there. Let's see here. I'm continuing mic check. King, the Wire Fox Terrier, claims Best in Show title at the 143rd Westminster Dog Show. New York, a Wire Fox Terrier named King was named Best in Show Tuesday night at the 143rd Annual Westminster Kennel Club Dog Show. King is the first terrier to be named Best in Show since Sky, who was also a Fox Terrier, won in 2010. But terriers have been the most dominant group in Westminster history, beginning with Warren Remedy, who was named Best in Show in each of the first 3 years of competition from 1907 to 1909. Terriers have now claimed the top spot 47 times. Is that good? They want a mic check from up here? Or are they good? All right, let's see. That's one of the breeds I know really well, said Best in Show judge Peter Green, and King is as good as it gets. Everything about it, the head, the expression, everything is really, really as good as it gets. And then the handler has him in perfect condition. Wire Fox Terriers in specific have been Westminster. All right, good.
Here's the chair's mic. Check 1, 2, check 1, 2. Check 1, 2, check 1, 2, 3. Check 1, 2, check 1, 2, 3. Check 1, 2, check 1, 2. Witness. Witness 1, 2, number 2. Check 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Number 4, number 4. Number 5, number 5. Check 1, 2, check 1, 2, 3. All right, we're happy.
Mic check 1 2 3 4 5 6 7. Testing 1 2 3 4 5. Mic check 1 2 3 4 5 6 7. Testing 1 2 3 4 5 6 7. Mic check. Mic check 1 2 3 4 5.
talk. Welcome, everyone. We are somewhat late in starting this hearing because all the women of the House and Senate take a picture every year to draw attention to women's heart health. And that's why we all are dressed in red today. So if you see members who are of the distaff version coming in, that's because that picture is still being taken right now. But I think without any objection, we will start with them in absentia and move forward. So this meeting will come to order. My name is Jackie Spear. I'm the chair of the Subcommittee of Military Personnel, and I welcome all of you who are here today, those who are witnesses, and those as members of the audience. I was profoundly disturbed when I read the annual report on sexual harassment and violence at the military service academies. The results show that after a decade plus of concerted efforts to address sexual harassment and assault, the problem has only grown worse. I believe we all appreciate how alarming these numbers are. I cannot stress enough that this survey is among the best measures of the prevalence of unwanted sexual contact and harassment at any university, company, or organization. The survey has been administered for over a decade with the same questions and an expert-approved measurement. 68% of the students participated. This isn't a blip, a Me Too bump, or some accident. It is a clear illustration of a destructive trend and a systemic problem. The report says that in 4 years, occurrences of unwanted sexual contact increased from 327 to 747, more than doubling the number of sexual assaults at the military academies. Now, the term unwanted sexual contact is being defined in the survey by asking very specific questions, which I'm going to read now, lest any of us think that this is some mild tap on the buttocks. The questions are, sexually touched, the question is, unwanted sexual contact behavior. Sexually touched you, for example, intentionally touching of genitalia, buttocks, breasts if you are a woman, or made you sexually touch them. Attempted to make you have sexual intercourse, but was not successful. Made you have sexual intercourse. Attempted to make you perform or receive oral sex, anal sex, or penetration by a finger or object, but was not successful. Made you perform or receive oral sex, anal sex, or penetration by a finger or object. Those were the questions asked, and the answers to those in questions doubled from 327 to 747. What makes this even more disturbing is that the number of reported sexual assaults occurring at the academies remained stagnant. That means the numbers went up dramatically, but the numbers who actually reported stayed the same. Only 12% of assaulted individuals formally reported. So we have to ask the question, why is it that only 12% of those who have been sexually assaulted in the terms that I have just spoken did not come forward? Low reports should be no surprise, given that half of those who did report were retaliated against. 37% of those who reported experienced social ostracism, reflecting a culture defined by victim blaming. One of these 747 plus assaults and 69 unrestricted reports, the academies only convicted 4 perpetrators. Victims report at their own peril. That is the message that is being sent, because they are more likely to face consequences than their perpetrators. The case of Ariana Bullard and Stephanie Gross, former West Point students who have previously appeared before this subcommittee, demonstrate the problem. Ariana, a top swimming recruit, was ostracized by her peers when she reported that fellow swim team members had sexually harassed her as a freshman. So who was punished? She was. She had to train alone. Stephanie was violently raped the same year, and an investigation found insufficient evidence to bring charges against her rapist. After Stephanie was raped again, she considered not reporting, fearing that again no one would believe her. Stephanie reported anyway, and her attacker was convicted of assault, but not sexual assault. Stephanie and Ariana faced mounting retaliation in the form of mental fitness and drug tests until they chose to leave the academy. This type of treatment for the brave few that do report deters the rest. Meanwhile, half of all women at the academies reported being pervasively or severely sexually harassed in the 2017-2018 academic year. Think about that for a minute. 1/2 of the women cadets and midshipmen reported being sexually harassed. That's 1,622 future officers who start their careers being harassed by their peers. None of them reported formally, not one. Sex harassment can be a precursor to assault. We need to appreciate that. The survey also found that only 56% of the cadets and midshipmen think their peer leaders make honest and reasonable efforts to stop assault. So if the peer leaders are not people you can trust, it shouldn't surprise us that they're not reporting. And despite the department touting relatively high trust in uniformed leadership, that number of 70% is worse than it was 2 years ago. To live, study, and learn in an environment where harassment is so pervasive, expected, and accepted that half of all women are harassed and none report is a stunning rebuke in the confidence of the system and a stunning example of perseverance by the young women. My colleagues and I have had the privilege to appoint high school seniors for admission to the academies. It's one of the great privileges we have as members of Congress. They are consistently among the best, brightest, and most accomplished young people in our communities. They are earnest, respectful, and dedicated. And then they go away to school, and we get this. I wonder if we're missing something when we recommend them, if we should be looking more closely at their moral fitness, or if the culture at these schools is that corrupting. Perhaps it's a little bit of both. I do know this. 3 out of the 4 high school seniors that I recommended for admission this year are women. Women will continue to attend the academies and serve our country. All 3 academies freshman class have at least 24%. And I understand that next year the numbers will grow. So the number of women coming to the academies is only going to grow, and that's why it is essential that we fix this problem. These results don't call for tweaks and adjustments. The superintendents have been touting incremental fixes made after this survey were administered, but there is no reason we should expect adjustments to change the overall trend. This report is a scathing indictment of the Academy's culture. We need to expand our toolbox and use both carrots and sticks to hold perpetrators accountable and deter others through serious repercussions. Academy leaders must promote a strong culture of dignity, respect, educate students on right and wrong, and have zero tolerance for violations. The superintendents have said they're doing much of this, but the problem has gotten worse. Leaders must earn students' trust by making good on promises to impose severe penalties on predators. They must treat survivors uniformly, modeling best practices from other academies. And they must address the issues that stem from over 25% of the students self-identifying as being problematic drinkers. I guess my message really is quite simple. I'm putting the academies on notice. We're putting all of you in the situation where it's time for us to recognize that this is a crisis. And I intend to watch it like a hawk. You know, it's time for us to elevate the brave women and some men who come forward and knowing full well that retaliation is likely, and instead take the kinds of actions against perpetrators that will finally rid us of this rot. Today we have two panels. During the first panel, we will have the opportunity to hear from outside experts who have dedicated their careers to these sensitive issues. During the second panel, the Department of Defense and the superintendents of our military service academies will explain why their current approaches to this problem have failed and how we can rethink our approaches to sexual violence at our academies. I look forward to hearing from all of you today, but before I introduce our first panel, let me offer Ranking Member Kelly an opportunity to make some opening remarks.
Thank you to the chair. First, I want to congratulate Representative Spear on becoming the chairwoman of this very important subcommittee on the very important Armed Services Committee. I want to welcome our fellow members of the subcommittee on both sides. I look forward to working with each of you on all the issues impacting our service members and their families. I also am very troubled by the results of this year's annual report on sexual harassment and violence at the military service academies. Just as the nation continues to struggle with an increase in sexual violence, it is clear that the military and our service academies are not immune from this crisis. Every cadet and midshipman is told from day one that they must rely on each other in order to succeed at the academy. The vast majority of cadets and midshipmen treat each other with dignity and respect and go on to distinguished careers in the military. However, when a cadet or midshipman preys on another through sexual assault or harassment, the betrayal is profound and shakes the institution to its core. These horrific crimes not only deeply impact the victim, they do wide-ranging damage to the entire academy and to our society as a whole. The academies have put enormous resources and attention towards improving sexual assault prevention and response. Nonetheless, the problems seem to be getting worse. While this is a multifaceted and difficult issue, one thing is clear. The results of this survey are unacceptable, and the leadership of the military service academies must redouble their efforts in order to fix this immediately. Therefore, I look forward to hearing from both of our panels today about how to improve sexual assault prevention and response. I'm particularly interested to hear from the superintendents about their plans to address this increase in prevalence. I'm interested to hear more about the efforts to enhance pre-admission screening in order to accurately identify candidates who have character issues that may preclude their admissions. I would also like to hear more about how the academies are improving prevention and intervention efforts to ensure they resonate with young cadets and midshipmen. Finally, as a former district attorney who has prosecuted sex crimes, I would like to learn more about how the academies use the judicial and administrative authorities they have to hold perpetrators accountable. One case of sexual assault, violence, or harassment is one too many. And one case of sexual assault that is not reported because of systemic problems is unacceptable. I want to hear how each of the service academies is proceeding to address this critical issue. With that, I look forward to hearing from both of our panels, and I yield back. Thank you, Ms. Spear.
Thank you, Ranking Member Kelly. Each witness will have the opportunity to present his or her testimony, and each member will have an opportunity to question the witnesses for 5 minutes. We respectfully ask the witnesses to summarize their testimony in 5 minutes. Your written comments and statements will be made part of the record. So now we will welcome our first panel. First, retired Colonel Don Christensen, United States Air Force, who's president of Protect Our Defenders. And second, retired Colonel Lawrence Morris of the U.S. Army, Chief of Staff now to the Catholic University of America. Welcome to both of you, and Colonel Christensen, you can begin.
Chairwoman Spear and Ranking Member Kelly, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you on this vitally important topic for our nation's security. As a brief introduction, I retired after 23 years service as an Air Force JAG. During that time, I served twice as a defense counsel, multiple times as a prosecutor, including as the chief prosecutor for Europe and Southwest Asia, and as the chief prosecutor for the United States Air Force. I have served as a trial judge, and I had been selected to serve as an appellate judge when I elected to retire. For the last 4 years, I've been the president of Protect Our Defenders, a human rights organization dedicated to advocating for victims of military sexual trauma. We provide attorneys free of charge, and I myself represent clients who are going through the often hostile military justice process. During this time, I have talked with hundreds of survivors, including those from all of the service academies. As Congresswoman Spear has very succinctly and very correctly identified, there is a huge problem with sexual assault at the academies. The one thing that I really think needs to be brought to this committee's attention is these rates compared to the civilian or to the active duty force. 16%, just about 16% of the women at the academies are sexually assaulted. That is 4 times the rate of the active duty force. For men, 2.4%. That's 3 times the rate of the active duty force. These are sobering estimates, especially when we compare it to the active duty force. Yet accountability for perpetrators is almost non-existent. Last year, only 4 offenders were convicted at a court-martial for their offenses, and a tiny handful were discharged. This should be a wake-up call for academy leadership. The failure to weed out perpetrators means that hundreds of sex offenders are commissioned into the active force every year. That should be very sobering. Every year, hundreds of sex offenders are commissioned into the active force. We can only imagine the impact this has on the military's ability to address sexual assault and harassment throughout the services. A Service Academy Commission undoubtedly gives an officer an advantage for the competition for promotions, command, and ultimately the attainment of general and flag rank. The last 3 chiefs of staff of the Air Force and 5 of the last 7 have been Air Force Academy grads. The current Chief of Naval Operations is a Naval Academy grad. The academies have an impact on the active force much greater than the actual numbers of their graduates. It is for this very reason that Congress, the President, and the American people must demand solutions to what is going on. However, I fear the reality of the rampant epidemic of sexual harassment and assault is not being accepted by leadership. I also fear that leadership does not understand the level of distrust that the survivors have of the chain of command. When I talk to Academy survivors, the constant I hear is the fear of leadership. The fear that leadership won't believe them, the fear that leadership will not hold the offender accountable, the fear that leadership will drive them from the academies if they report, and the numbers bear witness to that. 31% of the Air Force Academy women and 32% of the women at the Naval Academy do not believe that senior leadership is making an honest and reasonable efforts to stop sexual assault. Almost a third of the women attending those 2 institutions do not trust senior leadership. Is it any wonder that women are reluctant to report when they're more likely to be forced out of the academies and then end up paying hundreds of thousands of dollars in tuition than they are to see their perpetrator held accountable? Despite sexual assaults being up 50% from 2 years and over double from 4 years ago, report rates as a percentage have plummeted. Unrestricted reports, the kind of report that allows us to prosecute a case, are actually down to 8%. 92% of the victims do not report in a way that can result in an investigation. We cannot solve this crisis of men and women are afraid to report. And again, what does this mean? That the perpetrators are commissioned officers and future leaders on our active force. Leadership controls every aspect of the discipline process. It is time for them to acknowledge that this is in their control, and it's time for them to ask, and for you to ask, what tool have they not had for the last 20 years that they need now? And what promise are they going to make that they're actually going to carry out with? Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Colonel Morris?
Thanks, Chairwoman Spear and members. I'll just try to highlight a couple of things from my prepared remarks. It was my great honor to serve 30 years in uniform, 27 of them as an active duty judge advocate and 3 as a reservist tanker in Milwaukee while I was in law school. Had a pretty typical Army career trying cases all over the world, later supervising people who tried cases in normal installations and in Bosnia, Southwest Asia. Had the privilege of advising commanders and later on supervising counsel on both sides of the courtroom, including when I served as the Army's chief defense counsel, the one job that I did seek during my career. Also was the chief prosecutor at Guantanamo Bay and the SJA, or general counsel, at West Point. I helped initiate the Army's training program regarding sexual assault for prosecutors and defense counsel after I left the Army, and then I've been at Catholic University since then. I also served on the Response Systems panel from 2012 to 14. I'm the son and father of West Pointers and the father of a Marine. Today, I'm just here giving my own opinions. I have 4 matters I'd like to mention. And first off, I expect that I differ little in my biases and expectations from Colonel Christensen. We had parallel careers in many respects, starting from the same law school in Wisconsin, and I think we both have a particular affection for and loyalty to people who serve. First point about data. I'm not an expert in looking at the data that's been produced and think at least it has to be taken for the idea that there's an intractability to this problem. It's not unique to the military, it's not unique to the academies, but it's stark in the way it presents itself and poses the question of how to care for, make people feel protected and confident in the system. It caught my eye, though, that also there is a relatively high level of confidence by the cadets and midshipmen in their senior leaders. So we do expect more of the academies, but that was a notable contrast. Second, on training. Training is not a panacea, but it does work and is part of the solution. I think in the military we have what is sometimes considered the conceit that we can train out of anything and train to most any standard and ambition or behavior. Tougher to do. Sexual behavior is harder to train out of than, let's say, smoking or drug and alcohol abuse and those sorts of things. And in addition, society's messages regarding sexuality are not always clear or consistent to the emerging adult, and our students at the service academies come from that same culture. Still, training plus accountability is part of the approach. Third point on administering discipline, where the military is unique and particularly well-suited to the range of sexual offenses because it has a uniquely rich range of administrative and disciplinary options. It gives the opportunity, rightly exercised, to snuff out the sort of precursor behavior and hold somebody accountable and send a message of accountability to survivors and observers besides the person himself who sees the system against him. I'm sure as well, though, that my experience isn't unique in having taken to trial in military courts cases that civilian authorities would not pursue. Last points on some fundamentals of the system and some cautions. It seems that one of the key questions you're tangling with is whether and how much to trust commanders and their counsel to rightly exercise the considerable justice-based instruments available to them. If you think commanders are unsuited by training, not being lawyers, or perspective, considering they might be self-protective or for some reason disinclined to attack sexual misconduct, then you might want another system or a great change to the current system. My sense is that commanders are pledged to care for, enforce good order and discipline, and that the uniting of command authority with discipline authority, leavened by the required and appropriate involvement of judge advocates along the way, is appropriate to the requirements of the service and the expectations of command. So dissociating that authority would reduce accountability and not enhance discipline in general, nor in the realm of sexual misconduct in particular. Last point. Defending soldiers and coaching and training defense counsel was the hardest and most rewarding work I did in my career. I'm also aware of the risks of unlawful command influence and believe, unlike our appellate courts, there is such a thing as what they call command influence in the air. that some participants in a system might be inclined to convict or adjudicate harsher punishment based on a perception of a commander's predilections. So in fixing the system, it's important still to take care to preserve the integrity of that system for all participants. Finally, we should be cautious in seeking justice-related metrics such as referral rates, conviction rates, average sentences. They might provide some insight into the workings of the system, but alone shouldn't be the major indicators of success in combating sexual assault. Thanks for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you, Colonel Morris. Colonel Christensen, what's stunning to me about this report is that we see the increase in sexual assault go up 50%, and we see the incidence of retaliation being such a factor in the unwillingness to report. Why, in your estimation, has the prevalence of assault at the academies gone up so much?
Well, from my conversations with cadets at the academy, there is a perception among many that senior leadership does not care. And as you see, there's such a lack of accountability. So for perpetrators, they understand that the odds of them ever being punished are almost zero. Probably have a better chance of being struck by lightning. And so there's absolutely nothing to dissuade those who would commit sexual assault from doing so. And then you have the problem of trust. When the women and the men do not feel that they can come forward and report without them suffering more consequences than their perpetrator suffers, they won't come forward. I believe 2 weeks ago, the Air Force Academy finally got a conviction of a cadet for digitally penetrating another cadet without her consent. He got a whole whopping 75 days of confinement while facing 30 years of confinement. So we have a process that doesn't deliver a sentence that deters. And then, after this happened, from several sources at the academy, cadets who have contacted me and said that there's a rampant social media campaign to shaming the victims. And that is kind of stuff that has to stop. And it has to be an acceptance by leadership that this is going on. I think one of the biggest problems is that leadership hears these numbers, but they truly do not internalize them as a problem. And I'm not necessarily talking about the superintendents. I'm talking about the people in between the superintendents and the cadets. I had an opportunity to meet with the Vice Commandant of Cadets at the Air Force Academy last year. I was representing a young cadet that they were talking about kicking out after she reported. And I asked him, I said, have you ever talked to a survivor when it wasn't an adversarial process? And he said, I don't have time for that. And to me, that was such the wrong answer, because you will never know what survivors are going through. The only time you talk to them is when you are trying to kick them out of the institution. So I think that those people that are in the middle need to accept that there's a problem, and they need to be willing to ferret out those who are shaming victims.
One of the issues that comes to my mind, having spent time with all of the superintendents over the last few days, is that there's really a difference that exists in how they handle the cases. For instance, in some of the academies, a victim can take a sabbatical. In others, they cannot. Some may want to transfer to another academy, and that hasn't been an opportunity made available to them. Some have wanted to, in some situations, there is going to be recoupment, not just at the junior and senior level, but at the freshman and sophomore level, where a cadet is found to have sexually assaulted. Do you have any thoughts on whether it's time for us to make sure that all the academies follow a similar process in terms of the kinds of resources that are available to the victim survivors?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is time for them to have a unified front that cadets and midshipmen understand that they're going to be treated the same no matter where they're going to school. You know, this has been a complex issue that they've taken individually versus in a unified manner. And so therefore, you know, I don't think there's enough of an effort to see what's working at West Point. Is that going to work at Annapolis? Is that going to work at the Air Force Academy? I also, you know, one of the difficulties that we face in the military is we have what we call the Uniform Military Code of Justice, and the uniform doesn't mean what we're wearing, it means that it's supposed to be the same. And each service has their own way of doing things that often pull apart what is actually supposed to be uniform. And I think there would be great benefit for, especially in the academies, each one of them focusing on how do we do this jointly.
Thank you. Ranking Member Kelly.
Thank you again, Chairwoman Spear. I'm of the view that we need to fully acknowledge the problem, and we have a problem, and I think we're doing that, but we need to get work on fixing it immediately. Mr. Christian, what are some of the specific things the service academies are not doing that they should be doing to reduce sexual assault and sexual harassment from your perspective?
Well, I think the number one thing is trust. And that trust results in reports. So, for example, in the Air Force Academy last year, they had 29 reports of sexual assault out of over 200 actual cases. Of those 29, 20 of them are restricted reports, which, for those, if you don't understand, that means they can't be prosecuted. That means only 9 people out of over 200 actually reported. And what did that get? Well, finally got 1 conviction. I think that there is a definite value to training. I'm not anti-training. I just don't think it's the panacea. And I think one of those things, as a prosecutor talking to a prosecutor, is to acknowledge that prosecution is one way to deter crime. Prosecution is another way to send a message to survivors that we are going to take you seriously. The second thing I would say is that I think this is a problem across both the active force and at the academies is experience level of the people who are acting as investigators and acting as the prosecutors. The services have to commit to making sure that we have the most experienced and best people doing those jobs. We have a ton of talent in the military, but they often get rotated out of those jobs very quickly. And as a prosecutor, I think you would agree with this, that 90% of the cases won or lost before it ever reaches you by the great work done by investigators. If they don't uncover what you need, it's kind of tough to finish it up at trial. So we need to make sure we have the best investigators possible. And again, this isn't a slam on the people who are doing it. They're very dedicated, very hardworking, but they don't stay in those positions long enough to become the experts they should be.
Thank you very much. You know, as a former commander who's administered UCMJ up to the brigade level, and also as a former district attorney and has seen the inside of both a grand jury and a courtroom, I think that is very important to look at. How do we collect the facts? How do we get the evidence? Because the case is only as strong. So very good point, Colonel Christensen. Mr. Morris, you have experience in dealing with these issues in both the service academy setting and a civilian university setting. What are the differences between how civilian universities handle sexual assault and harassment claims versus service academies? And are there any best practices that civilian universities are using that we can adopt?
The way in which they're different is the adjudicative process. The way in which they're similar and should be swapping ideas. I am the rookie here. The similarity is in prevention and education, and the great difference is in adjudication. So I don't think there's much difference in the way you have to smother your student population with information about sexual assault and about prevention and about dignity and respect and all of those factors that contribute to somebody's behavior. And as I mentioned before, you are taking a product of society and to some degree reorienting those individuals. In the adjudicative process, though, a great difference. Under Title IX, of course, there is the expectation since the Dear Colleague letter produced by the Obama administration in 2011 to essentially set up amateur, informal court systems, adjudicative systems, and they have proved to be really tough to manage, all coming from the right impulse of attacking this behavior and having a system that has enough credibility that it cares for the survivor and sends a message to the other students that this process has the possibility of bringing about justice, that it stings enough to correct that person's behavior, hold that person accountable, and deter others. The difficulty there is it is really quasi in being quasi-judicial. You know, you're allowed to have counsel there, but they can't speak. There's not direct cross-examination. All of the things that are limited because they are created and kind of cooked out of the university's processes. So the contrast is the military system, of course, has that full range of administrative and non-judicial options and corrective training and all that available to it, besides the cases that are appropriate to get to a court-martial.
I agree with Mr. Christensen that training along, we just can't train ourselves out of this crisis. But I'm at a loss to see how removing the commander and the authority of a commander, which has many more tools than, I can tell you as a former district attorney and prosecutor, has many more tools available than just a prosecution side. I'm at a loss to see, do you know any way, Mr. Morris, in which removing the commander from sexual assault prosecutions improves the situation?
I think I understand where the impulse is coming from, because it comes from a point of frustration of feeling like we are many years into this and haven't been able to crack it. While understanding that, my sense is almost to go more in the other direction, to hold commanders more accountable, to be still more demanding on those leaders to turn this around and to use all of the levers that are available to them. So the removal of them then makes them less accountable, disincentivizes them, as opposed to providing extra incentives and the appropriate pressure that the system can bring.
And then my final question, Chairwoman Spear, and this one I think is really important. Meeting with all the service academy superintendents over the last week, one of the things, and DOD, senior DOD officials, one of the things that is apparent is you've got dual competing chains of leadership, of leaders. You have, number one, the superintendents and all the cadre that are professional officers and soldiers and should conduct themselves that way. And then you have the peer chain of command and the peer pressure from within a group. And having 3 children of my own, I understand sometimes the peer pressure can be greater than parental or teacher pressure. And so what can we do to reduce the amount of peer pressure so that they feel comfortable among their peers reporting, and also feel that same peer pressure to keep them from doing sexual assaults or harassment? And that's to Mr. Morris also, I guess.
I mean, one of the unhappy results of this long-term struggle at all institutes of higher education is that there's a pretty well understood set of best practices in terms of education and prevention. You can vary from school to school, but there is an understanding of hitting them. I mean, at our school, you have to do some online training before you walk into class or your first day of school in August. And then they have mandatory training all along the way. There's this thought of what the industry calls booster shots at each year, so that as their perspectives on the world change, you're catching them again and you're trying to reinforce the right behavior. So it is the sustained aspect of it more than anything else.
And thank you, Chairwoman Spear, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Cisneros?
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Colonel Christensen, could you explain to me just the difference between restricted and unrestricted reports?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So about 2004, 2005 timeframe, Congress looked at the reporting problems, and one of the problems was that many victims were looking for mental health treatment or medical treatment, talk to attorney, talk to chaplain or something. But when they did that, because we don't have, for example, medical privilege in the military, they'd go to the ER, say, I was just raped, I just want treatment, and I'm not looking for an investigation, but they had to be reported. So Congress said, hey, we need to do something about that. So they gave the option of restricted reporting. And so restricted reporting allows a survivor to go to mental health, go to medical, go to the SARC, go to a victim advocate, go to an attorney, go to the chaplain, and get whatever service they believe they need without it starting a corresponding investigation. An unrestricted report is if the military finds out in any other way that there's been a sexual assault. By law, that must result in an investigation, and by law, that investigation must be done by one of the Criminal Investigative Services, NCIS, CID, OSI. And so if a survivor tells her commander, that's unrestricted. Survivor tells a friend, that's unrestricted. Survivor tells OSI, that's unrestricted.
But that victim also still gets services as well.
Yes, yes.
Right. So so you just kind of said can you go through that again? Like who are mandatory reports? If a victim comes to an individual, they're at the academy, or even the military, who is required to report that sexual assault?
Anybody other than, anybody who's wearing a uniform,
Mm-hmm.
other than the SARC, a victim advocate, attorney, such as a special victims attorney, medical, mental health, chaplain. And so if they tell anyone else, that's a mandatory report.
So according to this report and according to your statement, 92% of the victims are choosing to do a restricted report rather than to go and tell somebody who would have to then report it.
Well, actually 92% aren't telling anyone.
Okay.
About 4%, depending on which academy you're at, about 4 to 8% are doing restricted reports, and somewhere around 6 to 8% are doing unrestricted reports.
Okay. Colonel Morris, with your experience at a university, civilian university, if somebody came to an individual or doctor there at the university, would that doctor, physician, counselor be required to report that assault?
They would not, only under the narrow areas in the law where there's mandatory reporting, and of course that's mainly of minors.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. So one of the problems I see, and I mean, I understand the concern of the victim, right? We want to take care of the victim and have their privacy, but if the numbers are continuing to increase where they don't feel comfortable, where they can report it, and then it's going to be people are going to go and be held accountable for their actions. We're in this situation now, like you said, where sexual harassers, people who commit sexual assault are going out into the military service now, more or less maybe with the opportunity to do it again and commit that crime again. What recommendation would you have to get around this, to where we can go and to make the victim feel comfortable where they can do an unrestricted report?
Number one is understand what a survivor's going through. Mm-hmm. Somebody who has been sexually assaulted is usually suffering from PTSD. PTSD that's going to affect their ability to succeed a lot of times. It can result in minor misconduct. It can also result in counterintuitive behavior and destructive behavior. What we see too often is that the academies turn that natural impulse from being a survivor into a reason to kick you out, and that is the message that's being sent. The second thing I would say is making sure survivors understand that if they choose to want to pursue justice through a court-martial, that is something that if the evidence is there, it's going to be taken seriously and done. I think commanders have a role regardless of who makes the ultimate decision to prosecute. I just think that the person who makes the ultimate decision to prosecute should be a very experienced, seasoned JAG, not a commander. What needs to be understood is that within the military, there are 14,000 or so commanders. There are only about 400 of them that have general court-martial convening authority, and only about 140 of them actually use it. So commanders have a role every day that comes short of prosecution. And when we talk about non-judicial punishment, we talk about administrative actions that Colonel Morris talked about, those all still exist. But a survivor has to have faith. There was a survey done by the Iraq-Afghanistan Veterans of America that was just released a couple weeks ago, and they asked thousands of veterans and active duty members, would you be more likely to report if a prosecutor made the decision than a commander? Over 50% said yes, only 3% said no. And so I think professionalizing the justice system would go a long ways to doing that.
All right, your time has expired.
I yield back my time.
Mr. Abram?
Thank you, Madam Chair. As a medical doctor, I can tell you it takes extreme courage to, when you're an assault victim and survivor, to step out of the shadows and tell your story. So I agree. This question is for both of you, gentlemen. I do believe the academies are trying to work this out and find the right solution. Specifically, for both of you, what programs have you seen that work, and what programs would you change to help allow that survivor, that victim, to step out?
I don't have a program as such to recommend. I just have watched programs now, particularly when I served at West Point, and then watching it in the civilian world. The greatest thing is to make no assumptions about the experience or perspective of these 17, 18, and 19-year-olds as they come through the door, and to work from a standpoint of kind of institutional humility on information they would need to make right decisions. We have a little more freedom at a private Catholic school to fully bring out issues of how those choices are made and framed. But the biggest thing is to have a plan that isn't perceived by the students as sort of this obligatory burst of stuff, and then they don't hear about it again, or then there's a display or something later in the year. It is a prepared, planned out, sustained program that grows as the student works his way through the school is the greatest part, because then you don't lose them, and they have a sense that, no, they really must take this seriously. They're talking to me about this again.
So a continuing education.
Certainly.
So to speak. Colonel Christian, you have any comments?
Well, this isn't unique to the academies, but I think one of the most important things that has been done, and this is, again, a result of action by Congress, was the creation of the Special Victims Council, Victims Legal Counsel program. I think that is the most ground-changing legislation that has been passed concerning military justice. It is a game changer for survivors because they have somebody in their corner. As beyond that, I'll give General Severia credit. He speaks passionately. I think those words need to be heard. One of the problems, though, with command being in charge is if General Severia speaks too passionately, speaks critically of certain processes, or if any of the other superintendents do, as Colonel Morris rightfully talked about, that creates the perception of unlawful command influence. And it's one additional reason why I think commanders need to be freed to be advocates for change without having the burden that if they talk too much as a commander, too much as somebody who says this is unacceptable, that it creates unlawful command influence ideas.
Okay, and the second question, but again, to both of you, the way I understand it, most of the retaliation is from the peers. What can we do to prevent that? Colonel Morris, I'll start with you.
And I don't have a particular perspective on that other than in my prep for this, that really struck me, that there seems to be a substantial amount of that. Plus, you see the great contrast in the statistics between the cadet trust of their peers and the cadet trust of the leaders, right? Really high level, more or less 80%, I guess, in the 70s and 80s of leaders, and in the 40s and 50s of their peers. So as you're looking at how do we redirect things, the peers always have the greatest influence, and in the academies more so, because your life, have much volition in how you live. So just looking at it as somebody who once served there and looking at the new data, if I were to look at where to concentrate, it would be on building that trust and changing whatever is afoot there that makes the peers not a trusted source of support and encouragement and deterrence.
Colonel Christian, you have a comment?
I would say that there needs to be a greater attention to social media and the impact of social media on shaming of victims. From the clients I talk to, that is a huge problem, is the social media bullying. I know that's not necessarily easy for the Academy to follow, but I think they should make efforts to see what's going. And then when they see that that is happening, that, for example, the people shaming the victims in the case last week, that they need to speak out about it. Leadership needs to speak out.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair.
For the new members, let me just point out that when the plebes come to the academies, they are overseen by the senior leadership of the institution. As they matriculate into the sophomore and junior years, they are overseen by senior leaders within the actual military academy who are also cadets. So it's cadet leadership that is overseeing sophomores, juniors, and seniors for that matter. All right, we will now go to Ms. Holland.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you both for being here today. And what roles and responsibilities do senior academy leaders have in preventing and responding to occurrences of sexual assault and sexual harassment at military service academies? And second, how do you believe senior leaders should be held accountable for continued increased rates of the USC at those academies?
Well, I think the role is the central focus of each academy. What can the superintendent do? They are the voice. For those who haven't served in the military, I know many of you have, you know, when you're a cadet, people like General Severi and the other superintendents are gods, and their words matter. And so being that vocal person, holding people accountable, whether it's people on their staff who are retaliating, holding cadets accountable who retaliate. I think retaliation is just one of those huge problems that they really need to tackle. And I'm sorry, your second question was?
Excuse me. How do you believe senior leaders should be held accountable for a continued increase in rates?
Well, I say this mindful that they're sitting next to me. I would say that there are certain times, you know, we need to let people go, move them on if they aren't getting the job done. There seems to be institutionally now in the military a reluctance to hold senior leaders accountable. You know, General Eisenhower during World War II fired, I think, half his generals over the war. It's almost rare. It's an exceptional rarity. A general's ever told now, you're just not getting the job done, time to move on. And I think that's it. You know, how many times do you get to fail before you're fired?
And I agree and don't have much to add other than, you know, the superintendents are just phenomenally in charge of those institutions, even in some ways greater than a division commander or some equivalent in the field. So they are able to marshal all of that authority and prominence in constructive ways. And when I was the staff judge advocate at West Point, you know, one of the things our superintendent did was went to a lot of women's sports games more than he went to men's, just as, you know, just one micro piece of making clear that we really all are part of the same team. But it then requires at times to leverage that prominence and that power to potentially be unpopular by being just inflexible on matters like sexuality in particular, and driving home in all of the ways you can with those at peer and near peer levels. And accountability, same thing. You know, the traditional Army military methods of holding senior leaders accountable is sure appropriate at that level.
Thank you so much. Madam Chair, I'll yield my time.
Thank you. Mr. Bergman.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to both you, Colonel Christensen and Colonel Morris, for your decades of service, because as SJAs and as legal advice to commanders, good commanders rely on you for good, sage advice to make wise decisions on behalf of whatever unit they're in command of. That's not easy, and it's not exact. Colonel Christensen, you mentioned you use statistics comparing academy to active duty. Did your active duty stats also include a breakdown of officer and enlisted?
It does, although I could not off the top of the head tell you what it does or what those are. Obviously, in the active force, crime rates are higher among the young population.
Well, the point is, you enter the academy at the age of roughly 18,
right,
coming out of high school. There's a pretty good chance you're going to enter the enlisted ranks at the age of 18 or fairly close.
Correct.
And if you're going into an officer program, you know, you're going to enter, you know, as you become an officer, it's going to be, you're going to be 22, 23. Okay, Mr. Christensen, in your testimony, you said that Congress needs to either, quote, empower military prosecutors to lead the process and decide whether to prosecute cases, or if necessary, turn over all academy cases to the relevant civilian justice systems, end quote. However, back when you were on active duty, you successfully prosecuted many cases that civilian jurisdictions simply refused to. And my understanding is that the services still prosecute sex-related offenses that would never be taken to trial by civilian prosecutors. What is the basis then for believing at this point that the civilian system would be better?
Well, yes, I have prosecuted many cases, and I have prosecuted cases that were declined by civilian systems. I think to remember it too is that there are cases being prosecuted right now in the civilian system that the military would not have prosecuted.
What precipitated the change? Because you were on one side and you were successful. Is there some tool, whatever, that you used or the folks on your team used to successfully do these that no longer exists in the military side?
There's no tool the difference, but what we're looking at is a systemic failure at the academies, and I did mention that was specific to the service.
So what I hear you saying then is that we have a long-term systemic failure that has now fallen outside the realm of the service's ability, or in this case, the academy's ability to utilize the UCMJ effectively.
Well, it's clearly not being used effectively if you only have 4 convictions. There were about 70 actual reports that were unrestricted, only 4 resulted in a conviction. That tells me that we're not doing a good job of that. I'm not someone
What's changed?
What's changed since when?
Well, the cause of the change.
I'm sorry.
Well, if you were successful, but now we're not being successful, what's changed?
Well, I could arrogantly say I'm not there anymore. But
okay, well, that's a fair assessment. Any good commander has great faith in their own ability.
That's not the case.
Yeah, well, I tell you what, before we run out, because my time is, Mr. Morris, do you have any comments on that particular situation?
On the issue
of basically transitioning the cases to civilian as opposed to under the UCMJ as we would do it now?
I do, just because I've thought about it a lot, and it's the thing that all of us discussed and argued about among ourselves as we worked our way through the system, from both sides. So I have a pretty strong sense that a system that reinforces the authority of commanders in military justice is appropriate to the expectations we have of commanders. That you have to unite the responsibility, the comprehensive responsibility that a commander has for his or her people is like nothing else in society. And to extract the ability to bring discipline from that makes that commander less effective. And it's not to say all commanders are the perfect fonts of wisdom or anything. It's not a solitary undertaking. It's understood to be in most respects with the counsel of a judge advocate, and the rules for court-martial require that a judge advocate certify that there's sufficient evidence to go forward in a case to begin with.
Well, thank you. I see my time has expired, and I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Davis.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you to you for being here as well. Nice to see you, Colonel Christensen, again. I know we were working on these issues for many, many years, and rather than go back and review some of that, there are a few more specific questions I had. One is, Colonel Christensen, you mentioned that one of the good stories out of this is the special victims advocate. And I would agree with that. I think that we've at least had good reports coming back from time to time, that the training and the ability to actually testify on behalf of a victim was very, made a big difference, really, in the way that the victim was seen, I think, and understood. Do you feel that that's so in the academies, that the role of that Special Victims Council is one that you see reflected even for active duty the same, or is there a difference?
I think they're probably similar. Going back to what I talked about before, though, what I see is a lack of experience. Special Victims Council, all the ones I've dealt with are very dedicated, fighting very hard for the clients, but for many of them, the first survivor they ever talked to is when they're a Special Victims Council and they never talked to one before. I can't specifically speak to all the Special Victims Councils and VLCs at all three institutions, but the ones I deal with are trying. But what I have seen in my experience with them is that mistakes made by a lack of experience that have resulted in less justice than I think could have been.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. I wanted to double check with that. And Colonel Morris, I know that you've had that regular university experience. It is a Catholic university. Perhaps there are some different expectations there as well. But could you speak to really the differences that you see? Because we would think it would be cultural, perhaps. I'm particularly concerned that as sophomores, there is a difference at the academies in the rate of reporting that we've seen. One can suggest that perhaps the pressure on students is different as freshmen. As sophomores, there's a little bit more freedom. What do you think is different? Because I'm wondering whether, if you were to look at all that goes on in the academies, is there any difference, you think, between the pressure that young people are under? We know that it's tough. Academically, it's tough. Socially, it's tough. Physically, it's tough. I mean, there are differences, and how do you compare that to university?
I think no doubt there's an intensity at the academies that there isn't an equivalent to in many civilian universities. The harder question out of that is then what out of that entire package of, heavy regimentation, a literal regimentation on so many parts of your life, is there any correlation between all of that and what looks to be some reluctance or some lack of confidence to report? Does it relate to how we're running the academy? Does it relate to always being in a minority, right? No matter how high the numbers are, you still have a 3/4, 80% to 20% split. And when you're looking at all the peer relationships, which seems to be such an ongoing concern, it's both with the men but also with other women. And are there aspects of even energizing that subpopulation of upper class women to help to fix that?
Do you see any reluctance to take a look at that on the part of the academies, on the part of others who deal with this issue? I mean, how central is it? I'm not suggesting that alone is something that we need to be aware of, but I'm just raising that question as we look at those statistics. It is interesting to note the difference between freshmen and sophomores and going on to juniors. So perhaps that's something that, and I hope our superintendents are going to address that in a little while. My time is running out. Any last minute thought about that?
I'm outside my competence on current academy operations.
Okay.
But, you know, we have looked at, we had for a while a declining order of confidence as people got to be, as women got to be juniors and seniors. We expected it to be otherwise. And what it reflected at that time was they had kind of a legacy perspective of a not very strong reporting culture. And then we saw that change with the next wave who worked through, which just reinforced the idea that a continued drumbeat than we ended up with juniors and seniors previously with less faith, than increasing the faith through all 4 years, increasing their trust in the system through those years.
Okay, thank you. I think my time is up, Madam Chair.
Your time has expired. I would say, Ms. Davis, that one of the things we should look at, though, with the Special Victims Council is how they are being utilized, because with one of the victims that I spoke with, she only ever talked to her Special Victims Council by phone. So we might want to evaluate the actual exchanges that take place and whether we need more resources there. Ms. Cheney, you're next.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you for holding this important hearing. I commend you and our witnesses for being here today. This is an incredibly difficult set of issues that both of our witnesses, I think, have pointed to the fact that it's something we're dealing with across the nation, certainly at our service academies, but at probably every single institute of higher learning. And looking for ways that we can address the issue, that we can effectively address the issue, and that we can reduce the numbers is a priority for every one of us. I wanted to ask a couple of questions. Colonel Christensen, you began talking about the issue of restricted reporting versus unrestricted reporting, and it sounded to me like you were saying that the numbers in terms of cases that are brought to prosecution are clearly affected by the fact that some of the reports are restricted. Can you address that? And I think we all share the view that it's very important for victims to be able to get help and support without telling them they must absolutely go public. But it sounded to me like you were suggesting that the restricted reporting is some sort of a difficulty or a challenge.
Yes, as a prosecutor, you are frustrated by a restricted report because you know that there's a crime out there that you can't address. And it's not without controversy, restricted reporting versus unrestricted.
But are you advocating changing that? Okay.
No, and the reason I'm not is because for survivors, they tell us it's very important.
Exactly. Thank you. I appreciate that. And then one of the topics that we haven't addressed yet, and I'd like to hear both of the witnesses' perspective on this, is the issue of alcohol. And I think any conversation about sexual harassment, sexual assault on college campuses, including at the service academies, has to get into this issue of alcohol. And I'd be interested to hear both of your perspectives on what we can better do at our academies on that issue in particular, as it relates to these set of attacks.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Representative Cheney. Obviously, alcohol is a factor. I think it's too easy to look at as a panacea. If we get rid of alcohol, it goes away.
There's certainly no panacea.
Yeah, it won't go away. I do think deglamorization of alcohol is important. You know, and I think at the academies it's particularly important because we're talking about a college atmosphere, and I think that's where a lot of this responsibility goes on the seniors at these academies who are the legal drinking age, to ensure that they're setting the right example. So, for example, I've talked to academy grads who said, "Yeah, I remember when I was a first year, being ordered by the senior to find alcohol for him, and my job was to bring him a case of alcohol. And you were supposed to leave it in the staircase." Okay, that's something that needs to be rooted out. You can't have a culture that allows that. Getting at alcohol clearly is something that reduces a risk factor for sexual assault.
Thank you. Colonel Morris.
I think you can't emphasize that enough. Alcohol plus youth plus first-time unsupervised, there's a giant correlation, and I think an indisputable one. And it's both the formal stuff, how do you keep it away, the informal of managing it even if a person is going to drink, and then letting other things go on. There used to be a discussion at West Point about when the First D Club would close and the seniors would stream their way back to the barracks, not all of them sober. We always talk about the harder right. Is the harder right some serious crackdown that makes clear to those peer leaders that you don't take the guys to New York City to drink underage, but you really do step up and provide an example, an unpopular constructive example that has an impact on things like the rates of assault that you see.
Thank you. And I think, again, I'm sure all of us on this panel agree that we need to do better across the board. But I'd like Colonel Morris to get your perspective on, as we're looking for ways to do better and to improve the system, and we look at what's going on in the civilian world, and we're looking at the possibility of removing these cases from the command authority. Is there something that you see in the civilian world, particularly on our college campuses, that would make you think that would somehow be more effective?
No, and we've had a lot of, we have a good relationship with the MPD here in Washington, but of course, there's a reluctance to try the marginal case in the military, and I'm generalizing from my experience, but just not my personal one, but of my time serving, is much more willing to try the close case, willing to take a chance and lose the close case for the collateral benefit of serious solidarity with the victim and a person knowing you're still brought through the court-martial process, even if you escape not convicted. You have exercised the process in a way that has an impact on those who observe it and not just the principals involved in that case.
Thank you very much. My time's expired.
But there's 10 minutes left, and we're going to continue until about 5 minutes before, because we want to try and finish this panel before we bring the superintendents in. So, Ms. Loria?
Okay, well, thank you very much for being here today and talking about this important issue. I just wanted to quote back Colonel Morris, a comment that you made in your opening remarks that you were not an expert in looking at the data. And I just wanted to note from my review of the data that there seemed to be some sharp disparities in the data. It seems that, the number of women at the academies over time, we just passed the 40-year mark of having women at the academies. Myself, I'm a graduate from approximately 20 years ago. Are we normalizing this data at all as the number of women at the service academies grows? Based off of the number of women in the population at the service academies?
I can't answer that for you.
Okay. And there was a reference by both of you early on in your remarks that we've seen a 50% increase over the last year. And I'm looking at the data, and I'm looking at, first the number of reports for West Point, for the military academy, went from 43 to 48 reports. And then, well, the way that it is estimated, so this is the blue dots on the chart, cadets estimated to have experienced unwanted sexual contact based on the survey prevalence rates. The best I can tell is that this is an extrapolation from the number of reports to correlate to the number of incidents that happen. And if you look at that from the 15-16 academic year to the 17-18 academic year at the military academy, for example, it looks as though this jumped from 129 to 273, which is an alarming amount. However, if you're basing it off the number of reports, which more than doubled themselves, could this not indicate that we have an improved reporting rate versus an increased number of actual incidents? It's very unclear the way the methodology of the report is written and analyzing the data, how such a significant jump can take place in that 2-year period. And to discount the fact that actually reporting has gone up, because reading the comments of what the superintendents at each academy has done, it actually shows that they've taken a lot of creative measures to improve reporting. And I did have the opportunity to sit down with the superintendent from the Naval Academy earlier this week, and just the simple effect of, having moved the location of the person that you go report to a more out-of-the-way spot that was not as visible, when midshipmen wanted to go report, had a significant impact on their, willingness to report in what they felt to be a more confidential way. And also during the earlier remarks, I heard you say that senior leaders trust in senior leadership, that people would report was an issue. And I read the report, and I was actually quite pleased that at the military academy it says 85%, at the Naval Academy 76%, and at the Air Force Academy 80% have confidence that their leadership is taking correct action in order to prevent these types of incidents. So, I'm hearing one tone in your remarks, but that's not matching the data that's indicated here. Can you explain the difference?
Yeah. So first, on the data you just talked about, so what I broke that down to was the women. And so the overall academy rate, for example, might be 80%, but at West Point and, at Annapolis and at Colorado Springs, what you see is among women who have the higher sexual assault rate, their satisfaction rate or confidence rate was about 70%. So now you can say, wow, that's great, 70% think you're doing it good. When I was chief prosecutor and I had 20 prosecutors working for me, if a third of my prosecutors thought I wasn't doing a good job, I would think I was failing. I don't think those are really good numbers. Glass half full, glass half empty. As for actual...
I think that I understand your point on that topic, that we disagree on the numbers of confidence that we're reporting back from the midshipmen. And there is a difference based off of gender, which could be expected based off of people interpreting the question differently or having had different life experiences. Colonel Morris, you also said, quote unquote, I'm outside my competence in current academy operations. So I'm curious as to when the last time is you visited the academies and spoke directly to leadership there at either the midshipman leadership level, the company officer level, the brigade officer level, or the senior leadership superintendent or commandant level to have an assessment from their perspective on the effectiveness of these measures that they're implementing.
None at all. No formal contact. I've been up there a lot because I've known people who have
Thank
been
you.
there.
I yield the balance of my time. Thank you.
There's 6 minutes left in the vote. Ms. Trahan, you can go ahead if you would like, or we can... No, go right ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your service, and thanks for being here today. The survey indicates that there are far more instances of unwanted sexual contact than there are actual reports, restricted or otherwise. And as you noted, it does seem clear that accountability must be clear and consistent to make real change. Men and women must feel as though they will be safe and the perpetrators dealt justice if they're going to come out of the shadows. But you spoke about training being a constant over the years while sexual assault numbers continue to rise. I'm curious to understand if you see any merit in the training programs as they're designed today, and what other steps we should be taking.
Sure, I'm not an expert on training. I have sat through many of the trainings. I do think trainings have an important part of this. I think it brings awareness to issues. It makes people see things in a different way. I leave it to what I believe are very dedicated experts in the SAPR programs to develop that training. I'm not critical of the training. I'm just saying it's not going to end what we're doing. And so I think the right mix of training, how that is done, is left to the experts, which I'm not an expert on the training. As far as, accountability and where we are and things like that, going back to the question earlier about what's changed, well, when we talk about accountability at the academies, it's never been good. In the 2003 crisis at the Air Force Academy, I believe there were like 139 women who said they were sexually assaulted, and 0 had a prosecution out of it. So when we're talking about differences, it's just a decades-long problem that hasn't changed. And the question is, how many times are you going to say, well, we're going to change the program and we'll get a different result?
I guess my only other question in terms of, culture often reinforces training. What cultural factors at the service academies are at play in allowing these crimes to continue?
Well, I think one of the cultures we've talked about is alcohol. I think another culture is there is definitely perception there's a different accountability level for athletes than there are for the rank and file members. There was a West Point, I think it's the starting quarterback for West Point, who had alcohol violations, allegations of sexual assault. And, he led West Point to a victory over Navy. I know that's a big deal for them. And Army failed to tout his virtues as a cadet. He had some pretty serious misconduct in his background. And so when you look at victims who are being forced out because of what is really minor misconduct, for them it's very difficult to understand why there's this cultural divide.
Great, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Escobar, there's still about 250 to 300 votes that have not been recorded, so we still have time, so please go.
Madam Chairwoman, thank you so much for having this hearing. This is such an important topic. And gentlemen, thank you for your testimony here today. You know, the military obviously is a very different institution than any other institution, but are there other male-dominated institutions that could offer some best practices? I know, training, you mentioned we're not going to get ourselves out of this through training, but are there some best practices that have not yet been embraced, adopted, utilized as a way to try to attack the problem?
If I were the superintendents, I would have Terry Crews at my academies next week. They need to hear a voice from somebody like him. He comes from the sports and entertainment industry. He's been a survivor. What an amazing human being. I think the most important things for people to hear is actual voices of survivors. And the difficulty is, it's very difficult for a cadet survivor to stand up and talk to the cadet wing because of what they go through. But if you can bring in somebody who has instant credibility, and if Terry Crews can be sexually assaulted, anybody in the world can be sexually assaulted. And so that leaders like him who can speak powerfully to the issue.
Nothing to add other than to, once you have a sense of a program in place, leave it in place long enough to evaluate it. There's always a lagging indicator from any kind of training and any kind of consciousness raising on most any behavior. The military saw it and attacked it with unusual success with drugs and alcohol and fitness and other things. Sex is harder to do anyway. It's not just subject to sort of the solitary self-discipline that some of those other behaviors relate to. But there's no lack of really excellent programs that have worked at places, but put it in place, have a set of reliable metrics and monitors, and then let it work long enough that you're evaluating a system that is giving you, replicable results.
The other aspect that was mentioned earlier that's very troubling is the sort of social media bullying that happens as part of the retaliation. And that's something that's obviously prevalent, in every aspect of our lives. I mean, kids, middle school kids deal with a lot of that in a way that my generation never did. My children have had to deal with that in a way that my generation never did. But one of the things that I tried to teach my kids was about being witnesses. When they witness something, when they sense something, about being an advocate. And many times that's very, very difficult because then the advocate himself or herself faces the same retaliation or similar or sometimes maybe even worse retaliation. But is that a component of the training so that individuals who are witnesses either through what's happening on social media or witnesses to retaliation or bullying, that they have an obligation to stand up and show that strong moral character to speak out and act out?
Yeah, absolutely. And to the Academy credit, all academies, I think they have emphasized very strongly bystander training and the importance of bystander intervention. The surveys indicate that the self-report of people who are bystanders, that they do become involved. Obviously, a lot of sexual assault doesn't occur in front of somebody else. If it did, it'd make it a lot easier to prosecute. But yes, I think, stepping in.
But the retaliation many times is not in secret, especially on social media.
Right, and then they have to feel comfortable that when they come forward to leadership, say, I saw this, boss, I saw this on whatever social media site. This is what they're saying about cadet so-and-so. And bring that to them. And I don't know if they have that confidence level.
Anything to add?
Same thing. Social media has been a big and recent part of the emphasis because both of the chatter as well as the sharing of images and that kind of stuff. And then bystander, same thing. It seems to be one of the most tried and true. You know, we show movies about, you know, accidentally spilling a drink on somebody to just break the situation. So the students then talk about that and realize that's appropriate to them and a legitimate expectation of them as a fellow student.
Right, your time has expired, and we're going to thank both Colonel Christensen and Colonel Morris for their participation. We're going to take about a half-hour break so everyone can go vote, and then we'll be joined by the Director of the Department of Defense, Dr. Van Winkle, and the 3 superintendents. Thank you. We're in recess.